I would talk to you guys a little bit about what it was like back in the 80s driving my 62 Beetle as a daily driver. And my second car, because I've always found when you have a Beetle or a Volkswagen, you really need a second car because, there's days when it's just down for weeks at a time. Like the transmission goes out and you shake it all out and all that stuff. But I'll tell you about that stuff a little bit later. But my second car was a 57 VW Combi bus. So I was pretty committed. This was when I was in my teens. My first car was a Volkswagen. I had it all the way up until, 19... I drove it as a primary driver up until I was until 1987, 88. And sometime in 88, I needed to retire that car, and I'll tell you why in a little bit later. But I'm going to talk to you a little about what it was like driving the car every day, and what I found back then. Some of the things then, some of the parts were better then, but but I wasn't better then. I was not as good a mechanic as I am now. Wasn't as smart as I am now as far as figuring out stuff and making it engineered to do, to work better than it did back then. But that VW Bug was my primary driver for many years, and I drove it. I used to drive it up to the mountains, go skiing in. I took my skis in the car. I would go to the beach. Surfboards on the roof. I usually took the bus because the bus, if you had a bus, then that was the reason I got the bus, so I could get the surfboard to the beach without ruining it. So, and carry my boogie boards and stuff like that when I went to do that. Those sorts of things is the reason I got the bus. And it was my work truck. I used to carry my motorcycle in it in the bus. It was kind of like this one over here. Those of you guys are really committed to my channel, you might have seen my old Honda SL100 that's all tricked out. I did a short video on that. I'll be doing some more on that here pretty soon. Honda SL100 that had a super crazy motor in it. It sounded like the dirt bikes are today. But yeah, I had one of these, and it had small taillights like this, with different bumpers, obviously. But yeah, my 57 Combi, I used to put my motorcycle inside. I drive to go out to ride in it, and it just barely fit, kind of crossways like this. And it was just a beat up old bus. And that was, they were a dime a dozen back then. So, I was painted, but just the inside of it was all dented up and stuff, and had a wood floor as far as the back cargo floor goes. But the cargo floor wasn't beat up or anything. It just had wood down there. Somebody had it as a camper at one time, and I just left that wood in there because it was perfect for my oil leaks. And when I carried around engines in it, on my Bug, I used to take the seat out, the passenger seat out, and then turn it upside down and put it in the back seat upside down, and I would put an engine in the passenger car when I was out. Like my sister bought a Baja Bug as her first car, and she drove it for many years because I totally went through that thing and got every little kink out of it. And she drove it as a daily driver for many years back then. But there was a big difference between back then and today on the roads. Back then, it was common for you to see a car broken down on the highway. It was common for somebody to be broke down in one of the lanes. And that's one of the things that's happened today, that's changed a lot, is a lot of people's minds are not ready to see a car that's broken down in traffic, so they run into them. Back then, it was more common that you'd see somebody out with a broken throttle cable, or a driving 15 miles an hour to get home, or you'd see like on a hot day, there would be a line of cars all along the side of the road with their hoods up because they were overheating in traffic. Today, you might see one or two, but it's not like it was then. So what happens is people's minds are programmed for seeing things that back then that they were normal. Today, if you break down on the side of the road or you break down in the traffic lane, somebody's going to run into you because they just aren't ready for it. They're not used to seeing that. So anyway, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about my experience in a second here. So driving in the rain was always a challenge, and I always didn't look forward to rainy days in either bus or bug, because it seemed like the bus would always leak water on me as I was driving, and that wasn't pleasant when it was really cold out. The windows would always leak, because the driver and passenger, it would go in somehow and it would go down and leak right on me. Every time we went on a corner, it would follow down and land on me somehow, and I can't remember exactly how, because all the door seals were so terribly made on that thing. So on the bug, it was always a challenge, because on a really cold day when it was raining, it seemed like you were just fighting, wiping glass off. You were using tons of no fog, and it still would fog up and you couldn't see, very well. But again, it was expected. A lot of people had that situation in their old cars back then. The cars they were newer, so it wasn't uncommon to have, there was every other car was a VW. So people were really aware of that sort of thing. And, they were just kind of more ready for seeing someone who couldn't see. And, it was more compensated for than it is today. So anyway, so driving was always a challenge. One of the issues I always had, I remember, is, I worked on my car more than I drove it, I think. Even though, I tried to do everything I could to make it reliable. It always seemed to break down. We didn't have the electronic ignition stuff that we have now. So points and plugs were always an issue. Something doing with that, adjusting the valves. It was just like, and then it seemed like as soon as I put the motor back in after I did something, and I have to take it back out again. So I remember one day taking the motor in and out of the car like 6 times because there was issues. I forget, what it was, but it was different things. I think it was like the clutch I was doing, the clutch I wore it out, and because I was really hard on it, of course, being young. And I remember, I think the next day at the same time, the same day, I broke something and I had to take it back out again. And, it was like, man, so I'd be driving the bus, and then the bus would break down, and then the bus and the bug would break down at the same time. And I was constantly fixing my cars, and my life was fixing my car. So finally, a friend of mine said to me, he says, my friends were always like, man, dude, why do you have old bugs as your car? And I'm like, yeah, well, I don't know. It's just they get good gas mileage and everything else. And, and he was like, man, get yourself a real car and this and that. It's like, no, I like my old bugs and, my VWs, and I'm just going to keep driving them, And I had several of them. I had, 57 bug. I had, some other ones that I had, and I flipped them, tons of them. I did 50, 60 bugs back then. So anyway, I was doing I was just inundated with Volkswagens. So, but I was always working on mine. And the thing that stopped me from driving it as a daily driver was I had my first child. It was 1988. And I went to the hospital to pick up the baby in the car. And I had seatbelts in the car, so they couldn't say anything. But the lady goes, I go, oh yeah, and she goes, and she takes we take the the nurse comes out with us to the car. They have to do that, whatever, and they come up with to make sure you put the car seat on the right way and all that. And I'm putting the baby in the back seat of my VW, putting the seatbelt on her, and she goes, you're gonna drive her home in this? And I go, wow, what's wrong with this? This is my car. She goes, okay. And it was at that point I kind of realized that safety was an issue. So I bought another car and kept my VW for, I think, a while after that. And I always kept my bus. I kept my bus until just a few years ago. And I don't regret selling it. People say, oh, why didn't you just keep it forever? It's like, dude, that's like... I want a different car. I want a different bus. All right. There's other ones that are cool too. And I wouldn't mind having one that's different. I had a neat bus, but the other ones I could have, same old gets boring. So up it a little bit, guys. So reason I got another car. I got the Buick I got this Buick Skylark, and when somebody brought it in the shop, had this beautiful car. It was in great shape, ugly as shit. But man, it had air conditioning. It had, um, all this, all the stuff that normal cars had, comfortable seats. It was a lot easier to drive, front wheel drive, and it just needed a water pump. And the lady goes, "Oh, I'm going to go trade it in." And I go, "What?" And she goes, and it had like 100,000 miles on it. And I said to her, I said, "Well, how much you going to trade it? How much you going to get for it?" She goes, "Maybe 500." I go, "I'll tell you what, I'll give you $500 for it." And she goes, "All right." So I bought it for $500. And then I started driving that car. My wife drove that car, and every time I drove the car, it didn't break down. I didn't have problems with it. I didn't have like little nickel and dime little things going wrong, and had to adjust my brakes all the time. And some little thing would, even back then, I'd have things like my brake line would rust through or something like that, or I didn't have the money I had now to do all the stuff to make it 100% new, and just go through every little detail of everything, so it was like, I realized, man, my car never breaks down. So, you know, uh, that's what happened. I just realized that the newer cars that I was driving, even then, which are terrible compared to the ones I have now, as far as the engineering goes, were a lot more reliable, and I didn't have to go under the hood as much. So I forget what the next car I got. I mean, I always had a classic. I had a Bug, then I had a Corvair, then I still have my Nova Super Sport convertible. Haven't got that one out yet for playing around with. It needs to be restored again. So that's coming for you guys who are looking. Uh, and it was just like every other car I ever drove didn't have as much problem as my VW. So it became it was more of a pain in the ass to drive than it was for me to use. But so when I came back into VWs again, I came with a different look, is not, having to drive. I don't have to use this thing every day. I don't have to use it to go to the store. I don't have to use it for, mundane, normal things. I can actually enjoy the car. And if it breaks down, it can be down for a week and it doesn't really bother me. So, cause it's a classic. All my cars are all classics, and I just use them when the time and when the weather's right and when everything's enjoyable. And so I can actually enjoy the car instead of having it, drag my life down, and that's what was happening to me back in those days. And, I still like the VWs. I still liked working on them, even though it was a pain in the ass because I didn't have the money I do now to make everything way more right than I did back then. And I learned, I was lowering my stuff back then, scraping on stuff, then I get dents and my front end would run into something. And then, my tires were wearing out on the inside. I was just a young kid doing what young kids do, learning. And now I've learned that leaving it stock is a whole lot easier than keeping it lowered and doing all that stuff. And, so, now I can actually enjoy my cars. So, one of the reasons I say to guys not to use it as daily driver is because it's kind of disrespectful to the old car to do that. You're getting what you want out of it, which is whatever. I mean, the being able to, the bragging rights to say, hey, I use my VW as a daily driver, but the car isn't really getting what it needs because it's getting driven in the rust, in the snow, and in the ice, and in the in the salt, and and in the rain, and the potential of accidents are higher, and all that. The car is the one suffering, not you, because you get what you want from it, because that's what you want. So that's why I say not to use them as a daily driver. But you can do whatever you want to do. That's the way I look at it. Is but again, you will find out what that price is. I sure did, and that's why I stopped using it as a daily driver. I still love the cars, still fix them, still restore them, and had my bus for all that time. Didn't drive it for a lot of years because it was just impractical for me to get around in. It took me, I could drive from my house to, say, Hemet, which is 50 miles away or whatever. And it would take me like an hour and a half to get there in the bus. And it takes me like, an hour or less, 40 minutes in my other car, so it's like, so I was wasting a lot of my time, and I needed that time to be able to, live and make more money and pay for kids and whatever. So anyway, I'll talk to you guys in the next video. A little bit of blurb about driving a VW as a daily driver. Talk to you next video. Please like, share, and subscribe.